David Sullivan straightened his necktie, hands quivering a little, but the bargain on the table had a keen mind. Not just any agreement was made today, it was the one that might propel his business to new heights. Opposite him, into untouchable heights, his business partner and dearest pal, Ryan was already scrolling while seated, nonchalantly using his phone, as though this wasn't the foundation of their success. David's gut roiled at that very moment with a mixture of nervousness and enthusiasm. He excused himself and went to the bathroom. At the table, the ambience was lively in the opulent cafe, with the sound of cutlery clinking and quiet discussions of the affluent customers. But once David had left the area, Emily saw a sinister development. A waiter approached with a calm determination. She wasn't present to replenish Ryan's water, inclination to focus on but today, the customer's ears caught Ryan's words frozen her in place. He spoke in a low, methodical tone. "Yes, everything set Ryan in motion." David murmured, "I have no idea once the business considers the deal by. When he becomes aware of what has occurred, he will very certainly be left alone, Emily." Her breath caused the water pitcher to leak. Her instincts were triggered and her heart raced, yelling for her to step in, but what? Since she was only a waitress, could she do? A spectator in the realm of authority and wealth, but she was unable to get rid of the seriousness of what she had heard Ryan say. David's most trusted man was planning a cruel treachery. David went back to the table a few moments later, unaware of Ryan, a storm is gathering beneath the surface, greeted him with a convincing smile. Anyone may have been duped by it. Emily, however, was standing at the edge of the room with trembling hands as she struggled to decide if she should stay quiet and go about her day, or should she put everything on the line to alert Emily, a stranger, balled her fists. She didn't belong in their mind racing. These people's designer in the world. Power-laden talks and suits were far from her personal life, yet she, unable to turn off what she had heard regarding David's unguarded. Her stomach twisted at her trusting manner, feeling bad for allowing him to enter a trap while she saw Ryan got up to answer a call outside before departing. David turning the table by himself, using the contract that was in front of him. Her legs felt like lead at that moment. She whispered as she walked up to him. "Excuse me, Mr. Sullivan." "David," she said. His brows furrowed as he gazed up in surprise. Somewhat, but he said it in a courteous tone. Emily paused, feeling her heart pound against. This man didn't know her and his ribs. She lacked concrete evidence to support her assertion. "I don't want to," but she had to try. "Went too far, but I heard something pertaining to your partner." Although David's face softened. Additionally, there was a hint of perplexity. Emily hesitantly leaned closer as he continued. "I believe he's," dropping her voice a little. "He was on the verge of betraying you. He said over the phone just now, once the agreement is completed, everything will be his." David blinked after being struck like a gut punch, attempting to comprehend her words. "I can't believe that. You must have." "I didn't understand," Emily stated firmly. Her voice quivers a little, "and I can tell I'm merely a waitress, and this may seem," he said, "I couldn't tell you, but I'm crazy." David leaned, something you wouldn't expect, back his thoughts. The room appeared to tilt just a little bit. This was Ryan's. The dude who's been my best buddy since college. Supported him during his restless evenings. Amid vicious boardroom conflicts, the idea of treachery was unthinkable. But something was present in Emily's sincerity that sowed the doubt seed. After a long moment, he said, "Thank you." Emily nodded in relief. "I'll investigate." Slipping across her cheeks as she walked, she looked anxiously back at Ryan was still pacing outside the door. She had completed her portion on his phone, but the burden of her revelation persisted as David's face became stern when Ryan, his charm was back in full force. Flat blazing, he slid back into his seat, and a simple smile So, David, where were we? Made an effort to grin, his heart pounding just. Reviewing everything one final time, Ryan. Nodding. He poured himself more water. You always check stuff twice, Sky. Because of this, we are a fantastic team. David nodded as his throat constricted. Missing, but the words now seemed hollow. Festivities that had felt like specific hours was now filled with uncertainty and uneasiness. Emily's plantings started to take root. Circling David's thoughts, might Ryan truly turn on him as the evening went on? As his concerns grew, David realized he needed responses, and shortly after supper, he stepped. He took out his phone to make a call outside. Julian was a private person he trusted, investigator with whom he had collaborated in the David, the past, answered the second ring. Sullivan. Julian responded with a sharp tone. What situation do you need to look at? David set his voice. I'm into someone for you. My business partner, Ryan King, is tight. Julian, something doesn't feel quite right. I'll get started right away, without hesitation. Give me 48 hours, David said as he hung up. The knot tightens in his stomach. Turned to find Emily hovering close to the CAF entryway, observing him with a combination of, I'm worried and hoping you spoke with him, asked in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. David said, he didn't sign anything, but I appreciate you reminding me that I need proof. Emily nodded, and I could feel her relief. For your sake, David, I sincerely hope I'm mistaken. Smiled tightly at her. Yet in his heart he was aware that the storm was still far from over. Julian called David back a few days later. In a grim tone, Julian remarked, You're not going to enjoy what I discovered. David clutching. I can see from the edge of his desk that Ryan has been transferring money from your accounts in a tiny sums that fall just short of the threshold of suspicion that he's directing them toward him. The transfers began in the offshore account. Around 1 year ago, at around the time you started discussing this new agreement. David gasped. How much are we? Speaking of millions, Julian gave a direct response. Nearly 5, and he's not just maintained communication with your rivals. He appears to be preparing to take authority over the business when you sign the. David's stomach churned at the bargain. Emily had been correct, and I wanted. David halted him and said in a chilly tone. How do I go about freezing the accounts? He has been utilizing Julian, who suggested that you have sufficient proof to support it, but be careful not to reveal to him that you're on to, till you're prepared to relocate. David nodded, Ryan's determination hardening. Went across a line, and there was no way back. Later that night, David asked Ryan to. Ryan had a private meeting at their workplace. Arrived beaming, but as soon as he entered the space, he sensed the change in the air. Ryan, what's happening? David stared as he asked, his smile fading. I know everything about him. His jaw is clenched. The cash that were stolen from the offshore accounts. Ryan froze in the betrayal, but only for a. He leaned back, his smirk for a second. Returning, you've been putting forth too much effort. David, don't lie. You're just dreaming. David yelled at me. I've seen the transactions. I am aware of the rivals. You've spent more than a year arranging this. Ryan's mask briefly came off this year. His eyes briefly flashed with dread before. He leaned forward and spoke in a beautiful, caustic tone. Yes, Ryan, I did plan it. Do you know what it's been like to be in your shadow as you receive all the praise? I wasn't going, David, and I deserved better. David's rage to wait around for scraps. You could have spoken to me, boiling over. We could have come to an agreement, but you chose to steal from me instead. Ryan's face blackened. You from us. Wouldn't have taken any action. You are. Being the golden boy kept me occupied, so I did what I. Ryan. David stated icily. You have to do nothing. Wasn't required to do this, and now you're completed. The accounts have been frozen. I have the proof. It's over. Ryan's angry face that you believe you've won. David, I'll make sure that this isn't over. You're sorry. David didn't back down. Leave my view. As Ryan bounded off, David had a surge of rage, sorrow, treachery, yet there was also. He was relieved to catch Ryan before it was too late. The deceased David stood in the vacant office. Ryan's threats reverberated in his. He had battled too hard to build his ears, much to allow everything to fall apart now. The betrayal was extremely painful, yet his resolve had been stolen by the confrontation. Ryan was no longer involved, David turned, but the devastation was far from ended. Went grabbed his phone and called someone within. Minutes after his legal team was called in, they would protect the business's finances. Were safe, and all connections with Ryan were cut off. All the money that was stolen was recovered, but even with the available financial protections, David was unable to get rid of the sting of betrayal from a person he had thought about. Family. David showed up the following morning, reached the workplace, and discovered Emily. She gazed as she waited at his door, reluctantly holding a tiny notebook. Emily, he greeted her against her chest. "Hello, Mr. Sullivan," in a lower than usual voice. She cautiously answered, "I just wanted to, after everything that transpired, check in." David honestly paused. "Are you okay?" "Her concern is touching, and I'm getting there. I was able to catch this in time, because of you." Emily stood up, "And I'm happy I might be useful, but is it truly over?" David, those like him, don't just quit up. Quietly nodded. "You're right, Ryan's hazardous, and he hasn't finished, but I'm prepared for him." But he paused first, adding that "you've helped me more than I can pay you back if you ever need to. Say the word if you want to." Emily's face reddened a little, but "You don't owe me anything," she said, shaking her head. "I simply did what I believed to be proper." David smiled slightly. "You don't often encounter someone with that kind of bravery in case you decide to rethink your mind. For the next few days, my door will always be open." We're a tornado of damage mitigation. David collaborated extensively with Julian's legal team to make sure Ryan was unable to strike back. However, the tension was still evident at that time. Julian appeared to be at peace just as Julian started by calling with an update. "We discovered something of Ryan's tone grave. Hune hasn't finished trying to disparage your." David's hand gripped the phone more tightly. "What do you think he's trying to contact?" "The media is spreading false information about you. Offshore financial misconduct. Most corruption is unfounded, but a small amount of truth could create falsehoods." David's jaw tightened. "Should we stop?" Julian reassured him that he was working on it. "I've already spoken with a few of the good news for journalists is that we have more than enough proof to refute him, but you must accept who you are." "David, things are going to become messy. The situation's weight bearing down on. I won't allow him to do whatever it takes." When the storm struck the following morning, a well-known business blog released an article that charges David with being immoral. The composition was rife with falsehoods, but the harm was investors began phoning right away, worried about the claims that Emily, the company's stock fell a little. Into his office with a copy of the David has an item in her hand. David asked sadly, "Have you seen this?" Emily's eyes flared as she massaged his temples. With perseverance, "This is all a falsehood. Can we do that?" David glanced at her. "We remain ahead of it despite the obvious weariness. Julian's group is already engaged in refuting the narrative, however the following. Emily, the coming weeks will be difficult. Moved closer to whatever you require." Her genuineness was astounding, I must say. David nodded in gratitude, his nerves frazzled. "Emily, you have no idea how much that means to you." Throughout the days that followed, David's team initiated a comprehensive reaction. They published thorough remarks refuting Ryan's assertions and provided proof of his deceit and treachery. The tide started to shift in the media's focus on painting Ryan was the antagonist the entire time. Emily was always there while she worked non-stop to help with anything from creating remarks to she quickly calms anxious investors, considering and steadfastly supporting priceless, and David started depending on. One night, she was more than ever after the office was empty, David discovered Emily continued looking over documents at her desk. "You ought to return home," he whispered, leaning. I'm almost finished against the wall of her cubicle. She smiled slightly in response, David. Emily, you've already done it, he said, shaking his head. Enough that I'm not sure how I would have survived this without. You looked up at him, and her face. I'm happy that you managed to stay warm. I was able to assist David, who hesitated for a. You're not only assisting Emily at this time. You are now a crucial component of this. Have you ever considered this company? Emily's role became larger, and she blinked. Yes, David, I have taken back a larger position. Claimed that you had proven yourself, and once more, I believe it's time to make it official in the ensuing weeks. Emily's backward transition. The leadership's behind-the-scenes helper. David announced her in a seamless capacity. Emily entered with a report in hand. The remainder of Ryan's has been frozen. Accounts, her voice was forceful, and his ties are reversing course now that David acknowledged that the truth about him was out. At last, the tightness in his shoulders subsided. He is finished and has nothing else to do. Emily was hesitant before using it against us. Across from him, you've dealt with. I'm not sure how strong this is. David, if I could have done the same. Faintly grinned. I didn't do it alone. You have been my pillar of support during all of. Emily's cheeks started to flush a little. However, she looked at him quietly. You deserve to feel confident. Someone to support you after 2 days. The last blow occurred when he was arrested on accusations of embezzlement and fraud following. Julian discovered proof linking him to offshore transactions that are illegal. Headlines changed to portray him as a infamous businessman whose avarice resulted in his demise. For David, the resolution was Ryan had once been a buddy, which is bittersweet, and justice was still hurt by the betrayal had been provided at the business's subsequent. David spoke to the entire staff at the meeting. We've faced difficulties that might have shattered us, he remarked in a voice strong, yet we emerged more powerful as a result of individuals like Emily, who serve as a reminder of what loyalty and integrity really mean. There was loud applause as Emily remained by his side, her heart swelled with. As the weeks stretched into months, Emily's pride remained successful in her leadership role, demonstrating her indispensability to the business, and David's observation of her achieved served as a reminder that even in the worst of situations, hope and fortitude could result in something remarkable. In the end, they weren't merely restoring the business, they were creating a new legacy. The storm had passed together, and they had the future to mold.